Hello everybody, tonight we are beginning our ASP.NET 2 course, and I'm going to be diving directly into the book and start talking about some of the materials. Hopefully you guys had a chance to purchase it. This book is actually a few years old, but ironically, the MVC 5 technology is really kind of just now starting to gain a lot of favor with developers. There is an MVC 6 out there that hasn't really been heavily used by a lot of people. But our book focuses on MVC 5, and I'm going to bring that up on screen here, and I'm going to jump right to chapter 1 and start talking about some of the concepts in here, and just a really quick overview of what we mean when we even say MVC. For some of you, this is a brand new concept. In short, MVC stands for an architecture or development approach to building applications. And it's not just necessarily for web applications, but that's the spot where we see it most. And really, what they're trying to do with the MVC architecture is trying to imitate what regular application developers have been doing for a long time, and that is a thing that we call separation of concerns. And I think you'll see that terminology used here a little bit. Now, given the fact that we're talking about MVC 5, then the question becomes, what about MVC 1, 2, 3, 4, etc.? Yes, there are versions that are prior, and as I was telling some of the people here in class prior to recording the video, that a lot of application developers are still working in those older MVC formats. There's some slight differences, obviously, in different tools available. But when people get comfortable working in a certain architecture, they often like to stay there. And despite the fact that MVC has progressed versions, developers don't often follow those versions in their work, at least not initially, unless they have some real tangible reason to do so. So the whole concept of combining ASP.NET, and knowing that you guys have all taken the .NET 1 course, you realize that there's really kind of a marriage of different things going on. So not only are we leveraging our basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills, we're also throwing the ASP.NET scripting language into the mix. And then we also have on the back end programming code that runs server side, and in this case we're working in C#, which is Microsoft's preference at this point. But we also have all those other tools that we learned in .NET. So think of all the little drag and drop things that we could just throw in, data grid controls tying into databases, server controls, base pages, all those kind of things that we learned. Those are all applicable here as well, but we're adding this architecture over the top of it that allows us to basically, for example, if we are creating a user interface for an application, to not have to recreate it all the time, that we just create a component and then call it in. And that's really kind of a powerful feature. Now, they do go through this process here in the book, and my intent here is not to read this to you. You should read this in detail. But I'm using this as a guide for my talking points. And the MVC architecture actually goes back a ways. It really kind of was a thought that somebody intelligently created in the early days of application development. And what's really fascinating about it conceptually is somebody realized that when you're writing an application, there's a few different components that are happening. First of all, you are usually, when you're working with an application, you are interfacing with some sort of data or data source. That might be a database, it could be a flat file or a text file or something of that nature, right? So applications often utilize data. So that's our M, that's the model part of it. That what we're talking about when we say model is we're modeling the data, and we'll get more into that. And then there's also the part that the users see. And that's usually referred to as a user interface, or if you will, a view. And that's the V. And then we also have the controllers, which do a lot of the nitty-gritty work of kind of like in a sense, directing traffic and then actually executing code to do the work that makes the application run. So the fact that .NET came out, right around the turn of the millennium, and it really came out as a scripting language first, and then more of a development approach. The MVC thought, though, really kind of goes much farther back. In fact, look at the date on this, 1979. That's going pretty far back for somebody to really think about an application in terms of the fact that we can take these components and separate them, and by virtue of separation, not have to reinvent the wheel every time we do something within an application. So we don't have to recreate that view every time or that interface every time. We just call it and implement it. So it's a powerful concept. But look at what the author talks about here. It says, it separates the user interface into three main aspects: the model, and it says a set of classes that describes the data you're working with. And notice, not the data itself. And that's a really important thing. So whenever you think model, you think data, but it is not the data itself, it's the structure of the data and how we employ it. The view is the user interface. Okay, that makes sense. And then the controller, a set of classes that handles communication from the user and all the internal components of the applications that they talk to each other and execute the code. So hopefully that helps make a little more sense. Now, originally that framework was applied to traditional application development. So think of computers of 1979, what we're dealing with back then. What were we dealing with? Console applications, right? So you're not really dealing with like GUI stuff, but we were on the precipice at that point of coming into the GUI world on a consumer level. Do you guys know who developed the first graphical operating system? Yeah. Yeah, that's the convention. Apple did not develop it. It was not IBM either. It was Xerox Corporation. Isn't that interesting? So if you Google that, you can actually see what they came up with the whole concept of the mouse and Windows and clicking and all that stuff. And you know what? They thought it was kind of a dead end. It wasn't going to go anywhere. Well, I'm not going to talk about what Steve Jobs didn't do, but what was fascinating though, so 1979, we really didn't have GUI operating systems, but Xerox Corporation was already experimenting with those approaches, and a lot of applications were, even though they weren't windowed applications in a GUI environment, they still were building window interfaces. And this goes with our previous class, Jason, where I was saying that first we write the code to build a window, then we write the code to go inside. And that's what we did in the console environment. So we kind of simulated GUI. And what Apple did very intelligently is they wrote a whole OS with that as its core, right? And it was revolutionary. So in 1984, they put out their Mac OS, and they had Windows and trash can, and drag and drop and copy paste, and more than one application running at a time. So it was pretty revolutionary stuff. So the people that were thinking in that era, in the 70s and going into the 80s, they had to like dream up this stuff from scratch. And the way they were able to leverage applications to work efficiently was to employ architectures like this and build those GUI environments. So now, this portion of the chapter really talks about MVC actually being pushed into the web arena. And why it's important, because now the web really, if you stop and analyze the way we use computers, has become the primary delivery platform for all applications. And if you're not seeing that, oh my God, you better start seeing it soon, right? So most software development companies really are not really worried a lot about native operating system applications as much as they're worried about web-delivered applications. So then taking that architecture and applying it to a web approach is really pretty important. So really what happens here is this MVC architecture really exists as kind of an application framework inside of the .NET environment. And really, for those of you that were taking also the Ruby on Rails class, different programming languages, different tools, but really the same concept. The model view controller thing is really the same concept, has the same principles. Now notice that here, as he goes into this section, he talks about the model view controller again, and then there's a little bit of comparison. But the interesting thing is, all right, so models, it says classes represent the domain you're interested in. These domain objects often encapsulate data stored in a database or flat file or whatever, doesn't really matter where it is. And then the fact that you're attaching to a database, you know, it often takes all those database rules that help to, like all the logic you use to build your database, and can travel with it. So all of a sudden you're taking that database power and functionality and really being able to pull it into your applications in a way you kind of could not before without some of these tools. All right, and one of the things that we're going to work with a little bit, or actually quite a bit actually, is this thing called entity framework. And if you guys are like me and you're thinking about maybe going to the, like looking for a job, like I know you guys are at this point, you'll see a lot of jobs where they talk about MVC and .NET and C# and entity framework, because they want to know that you've touched these things, and now you can actually add them to your resume in earnest and actually, you know, pain that you know it because you do. All right. Now, in this architecture, when we start to talk about the view, now we're not looking at application streams, now we're looking at HTML output. So the view for us is the HTML that whatever happens on the server is the HTML gets pushed out to the browser and what the client sees. That's our view. So it's just a different format, not a big deal really. And then the controller once again does the same thing, but here it really kind of acts as a bridge between all different components, and then there's other little components we throw in as well, as we will talk about them. Please take the time to read some of this, and notice before class started, once again, I was talking about the comparisons of Ruby to .NET MVC, and this is something that in the Ruby on Rails class we'd always talk about, is convention over configuration. So there's this mindset going into working with a framework that very often when we build things, we follow certain patterns. So since we're always following certain patterns, why don't we just come to an agreed upon way to do things and just always do it that way so that we can just get on with the actual work, right? Instead of like reinventing the wheel each time. So when we say convention over configuration is we follow the convention so that we don't have to sit there and tweak it and make it our own, right? So we utilize the tools that are present. The other thing is why do we have this thing that we call separation of concerns? And that is so we don't have to write the same code over and over and over again. If you're writing something that goes into a browser, a user interacts, and you click a button, something happens on the server and it spits back a page, I don't care what's happening on the server that's doing all that work. The stuff that's coming back to the page is probably got the same menu and the same header and the same footer and logo and navigation, probably the same content for the most part, except for maybe the one part you want to change. So why rewrite that code every time? Most of that code's already written, so we don't repeat ourselves, and that's why we have the dry principle. Right? So that's this little part here. So, and that's honestly, I think that's one of the biggest things about MVC and why it exists, is just to not repeat yourself. All right, and notice this other one, pluggability wherever possible. What do you suppose that is? Well, I'll tell you. And that is, we have, and this book does a good job of it, lots of libraries out there. And if you guys aren't figuring this out by now in your degree, a lot of work that happens out in development, people stand on the shoulders of those that have come before. And there's no embarrassment in that. There's libraries that exist, jQuery, for example. And we're going to learn about some others, things like Bootstrap and Angular and whatnot. And those things in a .NET environment, which you should have learned in .NET 1, you go to your NuGet package manager, you pull in your jQuery, you pull in whatever other tools you want, and the libraries are there, and then all you need to know is the syntax to unlock it. So if the libraries are there, we're using them, right? Don't reinvent the wheel, you know? So, and then I like this last one. It's kind of almost funny. It says, try to be helpful, but if necessary, get out of the developer's way, right? So what that means is really what the developer should be focusing on now is not the structure of the application so much as what it does, right? So if we have all these tools we can just pull in and plug and play, it's kind of like somebody building a house, rather than having them go like chop down the tree, sawing up the lumber and turning it into a 2x4 and baking it in a kiln so it's straight or whatever. You just go to Home Depot and you buy a 2x4, and maybe you cut it, and that's about all you do, and then you just use it. And that's really what we're talking about here. Get to the building, don't worry about what components you're using. Components exist, just get to it and use it. All right. Now, this is kind of interesting because he kind of goes through a roadmap here of what MVC is and how it started to get employed. So in terms of .NET and MVC, you can see the initiation date here of February 2007. So what we're talking about is a technology that's really not that old, right? So thus the reason why a lot of developers kind of get stuck in a version, because they learn it and they don't want to have to learn the next one. But it did go through iterations, and please feel free to read this and understand. But as they started adding features to MVC, building upon regular application MVC, they started to add little components. So they went from the regular MVC, they would go to version 2, and all of a sudden there's user interface helpers. What does that sound like? Well, pre-built user interface components, right? Like we see in .NET. And this thing called scaffolding. Now, my Ruby on Rails people know exactly what that is, because basically, if you have a data model in place and you have certain components in place, you can do a couple of clicks, in Ruby you would type a command, and you can build a whole architecture and a whole page with a couple of clicks. And then all you have to do is do your logic on it, and it works. So it's really kind of a cool thing. The other thing that they started doing as they started moving versions is they started to add a lot of API enhancements, meaning APIs, of course, leveraging stuff that people have already created and allowing these tools to use them within the framework. Really huge advancement. When we got to MVC 3, and like I said, a lot of people still work in MVC 3 and 4, we saw this thing called the Razor View Engine. And what that is actually another new syntax to learn, right? It's a Razor syntax that works inside of .NET that is specifically geared towards the view. And we will see that in action. So that was a big thing. And then, they show some examples here. And I'm not really worried about you internalizing those examples at this point. But if you look at, this older MVC approach, and this looks like a lot like what we were doing in the previous class, right? You see all the, the master page stuff, and you see the ASP tags, the content holders, and then you see some regular HTML, and then every once in a while you see some ASP code intermingled, and you do whatever. And then when you throw in the Razor View Engine, what happens is all of a sudden you start to see this @ sign, and it starts to replace. So all of this code, which isn't really all that much, gets truncated down to this, and it's basically a little bit cleaner and easier to execute. And this is view-centric, mind you. So this goes with the Razor syntax. All right. Then we got up to MVC 4, and the huge thing in MVC 4, and it's huge in MVC 5 and 6 too, is this thing called the Web API. If you just had the Web Programming 2 class, you probably learned a little bit about it. We had a little brief introduction to it. But basically what Web API is an application programming interface that helps to leverage a bunch of pre-built tools, once again, to accelerate development. But including it inside this framework was a big step forward. A lot of template enhancements, and then things like this, task support for asynchronous controllers, where you can write web applications now that behave like real multi-threaded applications, where you can do a bunch of actions simultaneously, of course with the help of the server, but still be able to execute multiple tasks at the same time. Big step forward. The thing about the web API, and in Web 2 we really didn't dig into it very deep because really it's reserved for classes like this, are some of the things that we see here. So things like routing. What's really huge about routing, and that's one of the big features of Web API, I know a lot of you at this point have taken your PHP classes and probably played with WordPress a little bit. And you learn in WordPress how you can create content, and then the URL can either be in this really messy format with a get statement with little question marks and equal signs and whatnot, or you can switch it to clean URLs, which is part of the routing architecture. So basically what that allows you to do is define what that clean URL is, and then allow you to route your traffic to whatever part of the application needs to perform it. But to the user, the URL is clean and not a bunch of gobbledygook. Really, who cares, right? It just works, So you don't want to type in hexadecimal codes and UTF statements and all that kind of stuff. The other thing that it added was this concept of model binding, and not only that, but the validation that goes with it. So that's a big component too. And notice that it says here, the Web API automatically maps HTTP request values to models. It sounds pretty neat. When you start to analyze what that means, all of a sudden, we can take our URL by virtue of the API and have it not only bring up a page or part of an application, but pass data to the application in the form of how we structure it. So you can type in a URL that looks clean, so you might say something like music store / shopping cart / checkout / whatever. And really what you're doing is you're actually passing data to the application by virtue of that and controlling the application from the URL. A really powerful thing. The other thing is filters, and this is where actually we kind of start to add behaviors. And notice how it says via attributes. And this kind of leverages the same thing. So not only are you controlling the application through the URL, but you can also pass data to it that way. And if you think about some of the stuff we were doing in Ruby on Rails, for those of you that were in that class, we were doing that in some of the URL building. So very, very cool. Let's not forget the scaffolding, where you have your data model in place. And what do you do with most applications, especially if they're data-driven? You do the basic database operations. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what those are, really what we're talking about is the fact that you have maybe a table or tables or combination of tables that have certain data in them. And often what you do with data is you either look at it, add it, or change it. Or sometimes you delete it, right? So the basic, what we call CRUD operations, you guys should know this: create, retrieve, update, and destroy. And because you have those capabilities, scaffolding basically allows you to kind of very instantaneously, once again, build out a whole application with an interface and allow for all those database interactions without doing a damn lick of code, or very little, just by calling it, in essence. And it builds out the whole structure for you. Now, you guys probably remember this from Web 2, but this whole concept of unit testing, that is really big in application development, and people spend lots of time doing that. There are a couple of other things that he mentions here. I'll let you read those on your own. But these new concepts are not small, and really what happens when they go up to MVC 6 is there's a bunch of newer ones that they throw on top of it. Granted, people are still figuring out how to use these. So take that with a grain of salt. Because that was, one question I get from people is, why aren't we moving MVC 6? Right? Because the reality is more people out in the field are not using it. That's the truth. So really, most people are still using 3 and 4. So MVC 5 incorporates all of those things, slightly different syntax, and MVC 6 takes it up to a different level altogether. All right, moving on. You can read all these boxes here. There are a bunch of different things that we're going to start seeing that are different here. Now, you guys are noticing that we're going to start looking at some even stranger file extensions, like CSHTML. Like you don't have enough file extensions already to worry about, right? Yeah, C#. Yeah. And what's fascinating about this, remember, we have these routing engines now that we're dealing with. Users never see that. They don't see what file we're attaching to. We set up the route so it's pretty. And then they just work, the stuff just works underneath, and we don't worry about that. Yes? Yeah, there are ways where you can still see it. And of course, you can always go into the inspect tools and things of that nature and see the files that are involved. But, very few people are like in the category that we are, where they even care. Right? And in many situations, even application developers don't care. They just want it to work. But if you're going to build something, you kind of have to understand it first. So, all right. The other thing that they have, and this came out in MVC, I think mostly 4.5, was this concept of bundling and minification. You guys remember when we talked about minification of like jQuery libraries, right? Where we take that jQuery library, instead of being like pretty JavaScript, we squeeze it all down, put it on one line of code so that it runs just a little bit faster. There's a lot of that stuff going on here. Another thing that's kind of fascinating is that whole ASP.NET MVC actually was released as an open source thing, which is pretty profound for Microsoft, honestly. And believe it or not, if you do a little bit of research, there are ways to write .NET stuff without using Visual Studio. I don't know why you would bother, frankly, because Visual Studio really is the creme de la creme of like IDEs. So, but the source code is out there, and there are people that actually walk those paths. Now, some other things about MVC 5, and I'm just kind of reading this bullet list really quick. So, I think real huge, the fact that bootstrap's included. Now, Visual Studio's kind of been including that for a while, but versions 15 and 17 really use that as one of the standard ASP.NET templates. And if you're not familiar with what Bootstrap is, it's basically a pre-configured CSS library that allows for layout control with a minimum of effort once you learn the syntax for it. So it allows you to do responsive design, columns, certain types of structures, menu placements, typography, colors, spacing, the whole bit. And for most people, using Bootstrap is enough to get a nice looking website. Now, it is one of the reasons why a lot of websites look similar to each other, but hey, if it works, it works, right? And when you have that in there, just the fact that it handles the responsiveness alone is huge, So that's enough of a reason there for many people. But you also have these other components, and he goes through them one by one here. And I'm not really too worried about a lot of this. Now, one of the things that I think is pretty interesting about this ASP identity thing is when you use older versions of MVC, Microsoft had built into the MVC architecture inside of the .NET structure, built-in authentication system. So if like you wrote a website where you wanted to log in, there was actually tools that you could go into your properties windows and set up accounts and do it right within Visual Studio. Now, that's great if you're strictly .NET, but what if you're like an organization like Gateway? Like, think about how, I can probably demonstrate it. Like if I go to log in to Blackboard, for example, and I don't know if I should really necessarily do that at this point, but if I log out of Blackboard, all right, and end the session, and then I decide to go back and log in, notice that, like, most of you guys just come here and log in, right? In an old-fashioned MVC application, the authentication tools that were built in create these interfaces, and then you just make sure your accounts are set up and you're good. But this new identity thing, what it basically recognizes is that a lot of people have authentication systems already in place, and we can leverage those third-party systems and not have to write an application identification and login system. So if we're already authenticating on Active Directory like we do here at Gateway, why do we have to like set up different accounts and different passwords for everything? We can just refer back to the authentication authority. I click login, and then it takes me back. So that component is added to MVC 5. That's pretty big, right? So you do see that quite a bit out there. So I think that's a pretty big one. And notice here, they point out, like, you ever go to an app and it's like log in with your Google account or your Facebook account, right? And what's your recommendation on that? For me, it depends. Generally, if it's something serious, I opt out. It's like, no, I'll just log in, right? Especially if there's like payment information involved or the information I'm handling is pretty serious. Because if you're using a third-party authenticator, they know your password, right? So that means they basically have access to whatever you're doing within that application. But think about it. So that's kind of scary. Now, if I'm working on my phone and I'm bringing up like my iHeartRadio app, I log in with my Google account, whatever, I don't care, right? Okay, so you know that I listen to certain podcasts. Who cares? But if money's involved, different. But the one that like I just demonstrated was this whole Active Directory concept, so tying into authentication systems that already get there. Of course, let's go talk about the bootstrap thing now. If you've never seen bootstrap, here's a very primitive example of the kind of interface it creates. Clean, modern typography, good spacing, and notice pre-built menu structures and methods. Assuming that most MVC applications are probably going to tie to a data source, they're probably going to require a login, and you're probably going to have a certain set of pages. So why not go with it? Once again, convention over configuration. Do you want to just write a separate login system when you can just click a button, pull the whole framework in, and it's there for you to go, right? Right. So this is, folks, this is what it's all about. So you've learned all this stuff and learned how to do all the nitty gritty of it. Now you're going to learn the high level tools, and now you're going to focus more on the application logic than you are on the tools. Knowing how to use the tools is important though, so don't discount that. It talks about the differences. So notice that that's the old-fashioned approach, and if you bring up, and we saw this where you bring up like the bootstrapped layout. And you know what, you've probably seen this layout on different websites, maybe even today. Right? So, so the website name, home, about, contact, register, and login, right? The big like content area section, and then 3 columns. I mean, how common is that? It's very common. And yeah, we use it. All right. We talked about attribute routing, and I'm not worried about that. They go into the scaffolding thing a little bit here, and once again they're just kind of talking about it in general, so I am scrolling through quickly. You want to read more about it when we get to those chapters, you'll get it, so don't worry about that. Now we're getting to the point here where we're kind of midway through the course, so we will take a break real soon. In fact, now that I'm saying it, why don't we just do the break now? We'll take a pause in the video and we'll come back and talk about this stuff. All right, so now we're resuming after our break here, and just so point of reference, we're on page 16 here in chapter 1, and this is the point at which we actually start talking about the software and how to actually build the application, so not just the concept of the framework. Now you notice that the software requirements here are clearly dated, right? Well, Windows Vista Service Pack 2, okay, we know that that's pretty much dead, and we know that Windows 7, I mean, even though it's still heavily used, is for all intents and purposes done. All this stuff works fine on Windows 8, 8.1, and 10, and all the various iterations of it. Notice that it also, all this stuff also runs just fine on Windows Server. In fact, when you go to deploy an ASP.NET MVC application, it must be deployed on a Windows Server in order to push out to the web. And the reason for that is all the libraries that sit underneath. So now they're talking about this ASP.NET MVC 5. as a separate thing from Visual Studio. You know why? Because it is. It's a different set of libraries that you install. Although when you install Visual Studio, it brings it with it. Okay, so it's all part of the .NET runtimes. Now here they're talking about Visual Studio 2012 and 2013. The book was written around 2013. Now, since then, we're, of course, 2 versions down the road, and they're ready for the 3rd version. In fact, I think it's already in beta. But we're going to be using Visual Studio 2017, just like we did, and we will understand that there will be differences between some of the templates that they list, how they list them, and some of the screens that we see. So we're not, we're doing this preemptive thing of saying we're not going to freak out to what we see. We're going to figure out our way around it. And I'll be real frank coming into this, I have not tried this stuff on Visual Studio 2017. So some of it's going to be new to me, but that's okay. Sometimes fumbling through it collectively is really a good way to learn, because a lot of what we do is figuring our way around issues, right? Just like the real world. Now notice that when you do have an MVC5 installation, of course, whenever we're doing anything .NET, it runs server-side. So the server-side components are required. So that what really makes it happen are the .NET libraries version 4.5. So I don't want to confuse all these like version numbers that we're dealing with, because ASPNET's got its own version, the .NET libraries have their own version, MVC's got their own version, and unfortunately all the version numbers are really close to each other, so it's really easy to confuse them. But the .NET 4.5 libraries are the same ones that we use to write any regular Windows application, for example. It's those common runtime libraries we were talking about earlier. All right, so they're pointing out the fact here that much of what we're going to do in the book, especially in the early chapters, is we're going to build a MVC music store. It's an application tutorial. And I don't need to move away from the microphone here. So an application tutorial that exists for free. So actually you can go out to the web and click on this site here. And of course, coming up on the second screen, but here it comes. And it is, if you read really carefully at the details here, it's actually built on MVC 3. And you can download the files you need, all the instructions for building it right from this website. And believe it or not, when I taught this MVC ASP.NET stuff to our SharePoint grant students a while back, I actually used the MVC 3 approach, even though at the time we were learning MVC 4, right? And it's all out on YouTube. So the whole application using the MVC 3 approach, I've already YouTubed it, and it's probably my biggest subscription driver for my YouTube channel. But I have the whole build of the application from start to finish, all the way through, including how to work with it in Visual Studio 2013 and changes that you make and all that stuff. So if you're curious, it's there. So now as we're working in this book, they are telling us that they are still building the application based upon this concept, which is helpful because really what they have here is they have a motive for building it, they have the data for building it, images, data sources, all that stuff, and then examples of doing it. Now, if you want, you could do this tutorial, but notice that they're using much older tools and older frameworks, and the book that we are using currently is still using that idea, but we're building upon it with newer tools. Now, to complicate things, we're using even newer tools than the book did, so it's going to be interesting on that transition. So don't freak out to any of it. I'm going to walk through it with you, just like we did in .NET 1, and we'll figure it out, whatever the situation is. Now, here in the book, they are demonstrating how to go about building an MVC project. So my temptation here now is to, hey, let's fire up Visual Studio and do this, right? So that, of course, begs the question, if you haven't been in the .NET class in a while, like if you just took it this spring, we already did everything in 2017, so you're ready to go if you were in that class this past spring. this past spring being the spring of 2018, this is now the summer of 2018 that we're recording this, and I should say that in the video because I think that's pretty important. Now, if you took it earlier than that, you may have used Visual Studio 2015 or 2013 or 2012 or God knows what. So first step for you, if you're going to join us here, is you need to go get Visual Studio 2017. So why don't we just do a really quick review. I am going to add information to the resources page about how to do that, but you can basically just search Visual Studio 2017. It'll take you right to the Visual Studio page, like one of these links here. And if you're interested in doing the professional, enterprise, or ultimate versions, you can go to the DreamSpark program. Links will be provided, and get a license number. But the truth is the community version is the same as the professional version with a couple of minor absences, and it's going to be perpetually free from what I understand. So here you go, folks. You don't have to spend any money, and you don't have to worry about when you're not a student, you can't get the product. So I recommend just go right for the community version. Why not? You know? And I think that the more popular it is with downloads, Microsoft will keep it free, and it's to their interest because it keeps people developing for their platforms. All right, so you can do all that work right there. So download the product and install it. Now, when you do the install, there are certain components you have to include when you do the install to make sure this all works. It does not all work automatically. And one of the things we might run into when I fire up my Visual Studio is whether or not I have those components included. Okay, so I'm going to show you all that. So let's go ahead and fire up Visual Studio 2017. This is the community version. And we're going to bring up the interface. I'm going to try to follow the instructions in the book, crossing fingers that when I installed this, I was smart and all the components were there. But if not, then I'm going to go to the installer and fix it. In fact, let's be a little preemptive. In fact, let's close Visual Studio. Sorry, if you have it open, leave it open. But I'm going to go to my start menu here, and I'm just going to type Visual Studio, and notice how it brings up the installer right here. I'm going to click on that and bring that up on screen. Now what this allows you to do is it allows you to see what components are installed and also allows you to add the components that might be missing. So there is going to be a certain set that you're going to want. Okay, like I have a choice, right? Is it? All right, well, for me, it's only 67 meg. I might have been more up to date. So mine's not 2 gigs. It's only 67 meg. And, boy, you can tell we have a lot of students on campus here tonight, and they're probably all downloading Visual Studio or something because the transfer rates are kind of slow tonight. But anyhow, so we're doing the update because we have to. So it's like watching paint dry, so I'm going to pause the video. All right, well, the update stopped. And it end up on this screen here. But what I want to see is what I already have installed. So I notice that there's an update button, and it's telling me right now I'm on 15.5.4, and there's a 15.7.1. Okay, I'm opting out of updating to that right now because I gather that it won't be finishing before I leave. But I do want to look at what is installed. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to click this More box and then click Modify. So I'm going to bring that up, and then hopefully what it brings up on screen for me is a list of all the installed components and you know, really a way for me to double check that if I have everything that I need. So you notice that I have all these things that have check boxes in, and on the right hand side here there's actually a summary list. So what I would do if I were you is I would look at this summary list, and not all of this is necessarily going to apply to you. Like for example, you guys really don't have to worry about Azure, Python, data science, probably Office and SharePoint unless you're in the Office and SharePoint program, but these other components are things that you will want. So what I was looking for most particularly is, do they actually have a separate library for MVC? And really the truth is no. It is built into the whole .NET platform here, so all those tools are available. But if you are missing components and things aren't working quite right, I would implore you to come back and look at the screen and then try to match it up with what I have here. So this is a concise list, and then this is like the graphical view. Now I do get some people that are like, yeah, I'm just going to install everything. Caution, it like pushes 80, 90 gig if my memory serves me right, so if you might not have the hard drive space for it, I would really recommend against it. But some of the ones that are pretty important, though, that you might overlook, this one down here at the bottom, the .NET Core cross-platform thing is pretty important. Clearly, the .NET and web development part is important, and the .NET libraries are very important. I think that also the universal stuff is important too. So just make sure that you have those so that we can do things. I do plan before next week, if I remember, mind you, to do that update. May as well be the latest version, right? They don't update without a reason, and usually the reason is they're either fixing problems or adding features. So both of those things you usually want. All right, going back to the book, and then I'm going to take the book and move it off to my second screen here, and I will be kind of looking at the steps. So I'm at the bottom of page 17, step 1. And what it wants us to do inside Visual Studio, which I need to relaunch now, of course, is to create a new project. So let's bring that up. Let it do its thing. And let it completely load up. So you see I still got the hourglass here. Pushing my machine pretty hard right now, I think. All right. And instead of doing anything off of this start page, I'm just going to close that and go right up to the menu like they show in the book. I'm going to go to File, New, and then choose Project. And you can notice right away that this is different than what's in the book, right? Because the book version, so in 2013, the file menu looked like this, and now it looks like this. But horse apiece, still the same basic approach. So we're going to build a new project. And then once you bring up the project, then we start to look for the templates. And hopefully if you did the installed templates, and then also understand that we're working with the Visual C# language, not VB. Not that you can't do it with VB, but C# is what this book focuses on, so that's what we're going to use. And then we're going to jump to the web section. And then we're also going to look at, which option here. And then I want you to be really careful, because we were noticing this in one of the other classes, how we have different entries in the submenu. So when you click on the root menu, it doesn't show you all the submenu stuff, and when you click on the submenu, it doesn't show you all the root stuff, right? But the thing that we are looking for is an ASP.NET web application using the .NET framework. Notice it lists differently in 2017, but this is the same template. And how do I know that? Because, hey, check it out. It says MVC right here. See that? That's a pretty good sign. So we're going to choose that. And what they're going to want us to do, so really, folks, this is part of your first assignment, is we're getting started on this Music Store app right now. Okay. So they do want us to name this MVC Music Store. Now, I recommend very, very strongly that you stick with the naming conventions that they bring up in the book, because when you go to start copying code, we're going to be working with, namespaces and applications and classes and whatever that are going to be using these names. And if you don't follow their names, then all of a sudden you're going to be doing all these edits all the way through the application building, and you're going to get frustrated. And how do I know that? Because the last time I did this, I didn't use the naming conventions they offered. I thought it would be clever, and I was sitting there fixing it the whole time. All right. Regardless, here we go. So MVC Music Store, we're camel casing it. They do want us to create a directory for the solution. And you see the solution name is automatically generated. But I do want you to notice that they are choosing something different here, because Visual Studio 2017, and I'm not sure if 2015 did this as well, but 2017 has this thought that they're going to take all the solution files and put them in this like separate directory. Guess how I feel about that? I'm not comfortable with it. I want all my stuff to be in one spot. So I'm actually going to browse here, and you notice what they're doing is they are kind of following similar to what I have. Okay, you're not seeing that, so that's not also clever. But see how they're going users, John, documents, Visual Studio, and rocks, right? That's not where I store my stuff. I'm sorry, Microsoft, but that's not how I do it. I put my stuff in my Google Drive when it's school related so that I can find it easy, and I'm going to go to .NET 2 folder. I'm going to make a new folder for summer 2018, and I'm going to put it here inside this folder. Okay, so now that I know what that folder is and I've created it, I can click in my file window here, copy that address, and then paste it back into Visual Studio. Well, actually, it's selecting the folder for me, so that it's pointing here to this different location. That way, I'll know in my mind my solution file is in the same spot as my project, and it's organized in a way that makes sense to me. If you want to leave it where it puts it by default on your own personal machine, that's fine. But I'm just telling you what my practice is here. All right, so then we will go ahead and click OK, and then it's going to bring up this secondary interface where we have some important things to choose. And I want you, we are going to make a selection here, but I also want you, as we're doing this, to kind of be exploratory, or at least investigatory, I guess, if that's even a word, and all the different types of options that are available. I mean, you can probably guess which one we're going to choose. Any guesses? MVC, right? But I want you to notice that Web API is also listed here. Web Forms, which is the kind of stuff we learned in .NET 1 for the most part. There's also what we call single page application, which is something that this book does explore. I hope that we can get to the point where we do that, because that's a very modern approach. Then they also have added to the modern templates, notice that they have publishing for Azure, which is pretty impressive in itself, right? But we want to make sure that we choose the right template, right frameworks, and all that. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to choose MVC, all right? That's our step one. The other thing that we want to do is make sure that this box is checked. Now, by virtue of choosing MVC, this box should have checked automatically, and I'm hoping it did. Everybody's nodding. That's a good thing. All right. And the other thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we configure authentication, because we are going to build an application that's going to allow for public access and also for logged in access, both for users and for admin, like a real application, right? So we want to make sure that we select some authentication. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click that Change Authentication button and then decide which way we're going to do it. So notice that the four selections that we have, so we have no authentication, which is what it was to begin with, so no logins allowed. Individual user accounts, which is the older approach that I was talking about earlier in this video, where we use the authentication mechanism that's built into Visual Studio that bundles with the application. The ability to actually tie to a third party like work or school account, like what I showed you in Blackboard, or use Windows authentication, which leverages the authentication mechanisms of your operating system. All right. So now the question is, which one are we choosing, right? Well, the book indicates that we're going to use individual user accounts, so that's what we're going with. And we'll click OK to that. Now I'm noticing, boy, that's fascinating. Like in the book, notice how they bring up the whole Azure thing up on the screen. And that screen is handled differently at this point. But we are doing individual user accounts. And I just want to make sure as we step forward, if you're wondering what my mindset is here, is I'm actually reading the book to make sure I don't forget to click on something, because otherwise we have to go back and do it again. And we're going to say OK. Now, if you're really curious about what some of these other options do, you can read up on the book. So on page 20 in the book, they actually start to detail what all the different approaches are and what chapters of the book cover them, if they're covered at all. And I didn't notice if they had a little checkbox for add unit tests, but if you wanted to build unit testing into the application from the get-go, you can just literally click that project or that box, and it adds to your project all the unit testing stuff that you need to do your testing, so you can run test applications to test your application. We're not worried about that at this point from what I can see. And I am scrolling down on my other screen. You guys can't see it. And here's what the author says. He goes, testing. All the built-in project templates have an option to create a unit test project with a sample unit test. He says, I hope you can get in the habit of checking that for every project you create. And he's not going to try to sell us. So here's a sales pitch. Just check the box. You don't have to know anything to do it, and you don't need whatever, a tattoo or whatever. So, you know what? Let's just go ahead and do it. It's not going to hurt anything, right? More is better than less, and we're going to go with whatever defaults it gives us, and we're all happy and fine. So they do want us to choose individual authentication. So just if you're wondering where I'm on page 22 right now. We already did that step. And then I'm checking all the boxes. He did add unit testing. And I think we're all set to click the button at this point. So we're going to click OK. And as you guys should be used to now, what it's doing is it's building up all the components. One thing that's kind of interesting to note, and it was further up in the readings, is a lot of the MVC library components that we're pulling in, instead of being pulled in as code that compiles later, it's pulled in as a precompiled code. So there will be a bin folder that appears here, and that code is precompiled. So hopefully at whatever server you deploy on, it's the same way. One little point that he's making at the very bottom of page 22 is as it builds all this stuff out, it's actually going to create two projects, one for testing and one for the application. And that's absolutely expected and normal. Okay, welcome to our first error. Yay! It says, an error occurred while applying transformation to the application insights config and project MVC Music Store root element is missing. Oh no. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do, folks, because you're going to have to click this box to make it go away. So when you run into these situations, now you want to look this up, right? So you can either leave it up on your screen or do what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my snipping tool, come in here, and I'm going to grab a screenshot of that, like that, so that I can refer to it later. I'm actually going to move this off to the side right now, and then I'm going to go ahead and actually click OK. I probably want to research that, but you know, it's like 8 minutes before class completes, so obviously we're not going to get to that point. We're going to figure out that issue, but I do want you to just take a moment and explore the structure of what was built. So we do have the MVC Music Store root. Notice a lot of folders that are similar to ones that we're used to. But notice the addition of views, models, controllers, separate folders for fonts. That comes from Bootstrap. App Start, App Data, scripts, and then a bunch of generics to start with. So I'm kind of wondering if maybe the unit testing is actually the part that failed here, but one way that I can check that is by looking here in the scripts folder, and I'm not actually seeing any of the unit testing stuff included, so that's actually okay. Did you notice, as you kind of cruise through some of these folders, and this is really what the habit you should get into, is you should just explore this, that there's a bunch of C# files pre-created. There is some CSS that's pre-created, some controllers that are pre-created, a few fonts, some models, of course all the scripts, the jQuery, the Bootstrap, some view files, and notice the kind of stuff that are in the view files. There's things that are account related. Look at all this stuff that's already in there. So like forgot password, a login, a register, a reset. This stuff's all built already, folks. Are you starting to see the advantage here? You're glad you don't have to code all these pages yourself? Still have to make them do something. Stuff that allows you to manage certain aspects, your standard pages, about, contact, and index. Notice that file extension again, CS/HTML. Some of the shared content, and you're going to notice that we have some of these files, and you'll get used to this, that are prefixed with an underscore, and that underscore indicates that they're what we call partials, which are portions of pages instead of complete pages. And that kind of gives you an overview of that folder. And then a couple of things in the root, and that's kind of an overview of the application. All right, so I'm going to move on in the instruction set here, and it tells you that once you have your application up on screen, that you should be able to, well, it looks like an error thing, it just pops up in the view. You actually see the page. Well, guess what? We're going to actually go ahead and we're going to hit the play button on this, launch the internal server. Hopefully that error that we got before isn't going to be an issue. So we're waiting for Chrome to launch here, and hopefully we don't get any errors. Crossing fingers real hardcore here. All right, yay, we failed already. All right, thanks guys, that's class. Yours worked, right Brian? Of course it did. And you're running inside of a virtual machine on a Mac, right? Yeah, and it worked just fine.
Hey, I want someone extra.
Now, did you get that error message? You didn't get that error message. Jason, did you get it?
It's not really yet, but I took a long time. I didn't get the error message either.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be brave and just try launching it again. I know that in .NET 1 we would have some of those issues, and I can see what some of the errors are, so I can check them because they're right down here. And I'm going to tell you what, folks, I'm not really too worried about this at this point. Unfortunately, I don't have the class time to fix it, but that's where we're going to start next week. So we'll probably next week repeat this process that we just did. It's a pretty simple process. And then get it to launch. But what I'm noticing is in this error list, it says could not resolve this reference, and it's probably just referring to something that's not. Yeah, and it's giving me a lot of details here, which I'm going to explore, and then we will resolve next time. Now, if you were fortunate enough to just have it work, bravo. And if not, no, I didn't do a rebuild, but that's really a good thought. Let's try that. So I'm going to come up here to the root of the application, And I'm just going to do a rebuild, which does a combination of clean and build. And what that means is it gets rid of like stuff stored in memory, and it recompiles it and then relaunches it. Well, actually, it doesn't relaunch it, just rebuilds it. But if there's any errors to be found, the build process should catch them. And it says it succeeded, right? That should be a good sign. Let's go ahead and try to launch it again. Maybe this time it'll work, and I can also try a different browser. Now, I will tell you that I haven't rebooted my machine in quite a while. So that could be an issue too. So, okay, once again, I'm not really too concerned at this point because we are going to come back next week and fix this. If I come up with a fix in the interim, I will post it in video format for you guys. But we're out of time tonight, I'm sorry to say. So I was just reminded here by my students that actually class doesn't end at 9:30, it ends at 9:50. So, hey, we're going to try to fix it now. All right, so I'm actually in the output window down here looking at the errors and trying to make sense of them. And this is going to be a process, I anticipate, based on experience, that we have some issues here to take care of. I really have a strong concern that if I probably rebooted my system, it probably wouldn't be happening right now. I could be wrong. But it says, I'm going to read the error messages. So it says, could not resolve this reference. Now, it doesn't really tell me what, but it says it could not locate the assembly, Microsoft AI Windows Server. So this points to me. That's correct. That's exactly my implication there too, which tells me that a reboot might help to fix it. All right, for a bunch of different reasons. But then I'm looking at this part, and notice how this is really verbose here. It says found conflicts between different versions of the same dependent assembly. In Visual Studio, double-click this warning. Okay, so here it is, and or select it and press enter to fix the conflicts. So Bill Gates is going to fix this for me automatically. Otherwise, add the following binding redirects to the runtime node in the application configuration file. So really what's happening here is it's telling you exactly how to fix it. Thank you, Visual Studio. So I'm going to do that. So what should I do? Select it or double-click this warning. So here we go. One or more dependent assemblies have version conflicts. Do you want to fix these by adding a binding redirect record in the application configure? Hell yes. All right. So now it fixed a bunch of the problems. I mean, there's still some ones listed here, right? But so I'm going to do that rebuild thing again. So follow with me if you're having the same issue. You guys didn't have that issue, right? Of course, the teacher has the problem and not the students. All right, it says it succeeded. So I'm going to go ahead and launch. Please work, please work, please work. But this is part of what makes this stuff fun too. And it also should be kind of an indicator that, don't give up if it's not working. So now I'm going to go back. It's not working again. And notice what this is saying. And I know why this is not working now. We ran into this in the last class. Where did I store this? On my G drive, right? Guess who doesn't have permissions on the G drive? Because it's my Google Drive out in the cloud, which has a virtual drive letter on my machine. You catching this? And I ran into this exact problem in the other class. That's different, though. Say that again, Jason? No, it doesn't. It's only online. So, okay. So here's what I'm going to do, folks. I'm very quickly going to repeat the steps we just went through, put it on my local drive, and just deal with the fact that it's not syncing to the cloud. So, so just to explain, and I'm wondering, if I went in, well, see, the problem Here's the problem with it. With Google Drive, what they did is if you're an enterprise client, right, you don't have that installable version that creates a physical folder on your hard drive anymore. It comes up in my file manager as a drive letter, but really it's out in the cloud.
Right. Which is actually pretty cool.
It is, and that's how the organization wants it. Now, what I'm remembering right now, and I should try this before I give up, is this class, right? I made this folder for putting my projects into. I have an option on the Google Drive where I can actually come in here and see that option right there. It says available offline. I'm clicking it. So what that's going to do is it is going to store a local copy. I'm not really sure. That's a good question. I don't know because this drive is out in the cloud. Yeah, that's a good point, Brian. Well, it's okay. And I see here the issue right there. All right. So here's what I'm doing. I'm going to try that option. I'm going to go back. I'm going to recompile once again. So I'm going to stop the server running. Oh, it threw that same error again. Let's do another rebuild. And I'm prepared to ditch the Google Cloud storage or the drive storage to work locally just to make it work. So, all right, so that's seemingly okay. Let's try to launch it. Now, if it runs, knowing that little switch in Google Drive will make it work is pretty important. My guess is it won't. Yeah, and I was right. So here we go. Closing Visual Studio. And
yeah, I think there's pros and cons to that. You know, like, because obviously then you don't have to store anything locally. You know, when you use your, I don't know if you like that.
I don't know if I like that. Now, Brian, you were mentioning that you're using the Dropbox, right? The reason that works is because there is a physical folder on your machine. So that is an option. I could push it. Yeah, maybe I'll put it on my OneDrive.
I like OneDrive seems to work, and that's why one of the reasons like the list I can on my hard drive folder and because I want to store everything in there.
Okay, so we were just having a talk of like why. Okay, so I just made it available offline, and maybe it should work. And then, you know, if you look in the system tray here, it looks like it's still syncing. And if I do right click, it is going through the process of syncing. And, you know, entity framework and all these things. So there's all these files that are still syncing. So my inclination here is let's let it finish syncing and try it, because maybe I'm bailing on it too quickly. But, you know, like all students do, it's like they'd probably be emailing me already. Not that I'm. Okay, says everything is up to date. So okay, maybe we're okay. Let's relaunch Visual Studio. And so we had this other complication too, right? How are the files syncing if they're open in Visual Studio and not saved? They're only going to sync if they're saved, right? But when we launch the internal server, it makes sure everything's saved, but it was saving to the cloud, not locally. But now that thing is switched. Okay, so maybe I should be able to open up my recent. That's not it, right? Recent files. Open projects. So we're going to go to the Google Drive. And this is not normal, folks. And I have to chuckle about it because, you know, why not? Let's open up the solution file. I know where I put it. This doesn't work. I'm going to plan B, which is working with regular drives instead of Google Drives. And so I have to tell you, I have a little bit of complaint here about Google Drive and from an enterprise level being forced to switch to that drive stream instead of the old-fashioned approach, which always seemed to work for me. So it's doing the build. This should probably be fine. All right. Now, are you guys noticing that, you know, the same error messages really are still being generated? That's what all this stuff is. So and I think it's all permissions related because it's a remote drive. Regardless of, now if it loads up, I'll summarily be quiet, but I anticipated this exact effect. So now I'm hoping that as you guys become more experienced developers that you'll be anticipatory about when it's going to fail or not too, and not get frustrated. So here we are. I'm going to relaunch Visual Studio. I'm going to store it in a different place. You think I should just copy and move it? Okay, Brian says I should just move it. Brian, if you say so, I'm doing it. Nothing. No, it was not like it was all that hard. It was like 3 steps, right? All right, so here's the folder. There's the folder. I'm going to copy it. Where should I put it? Google, OneDrive, Dropbox.
I like Dropbox.
It is, but I have a limited amount of space there, and I use it for all my illegal movie copying. So, did I say that on the video? All right, I'm trying to have fun with it, so please be mindful of that. So I'm going to find my OneDrive here, and actually why don't I make a new folder, and let's do MVC Music Store. All right, and then I'm going to paste the folder in there. Yeah. And you notice, man, there's a whole lot of files going on there, right? Because we're dealing with all the pre-compiled stuff. That's pretty weird. Yeah, so right there, that makes me think I'm going to have to rebuild it anyhow. All right. Welcome to MVC, folks. All right. So this is OneDrive. OneDrive is local to my machine and pushes to the cloud. See, I like work when I code. I like to have stuff pushed to the cloud because what if your machine dies, right? See. All right. Folks, I'm just going to rebuild. Yeah, and that's it. See how it says load failed? All right. Plan C. All right. But what I am going to do, though, is I'm going to just use the folders that I already have. So I'm going to delete this one. Yes. Oh, yeah. Good to close the application first, just in case. Yeah, it's a lot of files for a few mouse clicks, right? All right. Plan C, start from scratch. Now we really are running out of time. But this time it's going to work, right? So let's do new project. We know the choices to make. We are going to name it MVC Music Store. Create directory for solution. Where are we putting our solution file? It is going to OneDrive MVC Music Store. Selecting the folder. It looks like I'm putting Visual Studio through its paces because the interface isn't quite loading up. You guys noticing that? I think it's the ghost of Bill Gates infiltrating. All right. Choosing MVC, box is checked, individual user accounts, hack will add some unit tests, right? That's pretty much all we did. All right, so you see it was like a 3-second process. I should have done it right from the start. But please keep in mind as as you watch the video or sitting here in class, and I know you guys here in class are with me, that it's okay to screw this stuff up because this is how you learn. That goes for, I don't care how experienced you are. So it's doing its work. You can see all the stuff it's doing down at the bottom. No errors this time. Thank God. All right, now the proof is in the pudding. Just in time to finish class. launch the internal server, no errors or warnings, and drum roll. I know it takes a while. You know why it takes a while? Because it's running all those binaries in the background. So the initial launch of the application, and there we are. So here we have a basic bootstrap interface. Notice the pre-creation of 3 pages, real common ones for every app, the login and the registration mechanisms, and a beautiful layout, and it all works.
So where's that pulling from? What file is it?
Well, this file is the index file, so it's bringing up the home page. So in terms of which, in the mindset, so the question was, where's this pulling from? If you were to look inside your application, notice that right here, where was it? In the views folder, I mean, conceptually, this is what you're thinking, that you go to the home, and it's pulling up that view. But the truth is, there's a whole lot more going on behind the scenes that pushes this content into the view. We haven't run that yet.
Right, okay, so it's this index that C# HTML that.
Yeah, that's our view. That's not the entire page, but this is what helps to build the page. Folks, that was a success. I wish it would have been that way sooner. Okay, so note to self and note to students, if you happen to be using Google Drive file stream, not regular Google Drive, so that would only be if you're in an enterprise environment like I am, that you don't have permissions for that remote drive, so it's going to screw you up royally. So use a more traditional local file approach or a cloud account that syncs to a local file. And you can see it worked just fine. It brought up the interface. Please feel free. I mean, you can click on this stuff, and it works. It is. It is slicker than Ruby on Rails. It's a lot more powerful too, because there's so many tools built in. All you have to do is add your stuff to it. They got it set up for you, and it looks beautiful to start with. And I know that you guys have gone out to the web and you've seen websites that were built with these tools. You go, oh, that looks just like that one site. Yeah, because it is. Right? And that's the point, right? And we are going to customize this. We're going to customize the interface. We're going to add content. We're going to type the data sources, and we're going to make it do stuff. But we now have the start for our application. And next week when we get together, we're going to move on to Chapter 2. So really all you have to get done for this week is make sure you get Visual Studio installed and get this first chapter done. That's your assignment. And I know it didn't translate to Blackboard immediately, and I shouldn't record this in the video because we had some Blackboard issues, but it will be there next week. All right, guys, we are done.